Professor Zafar Iqbal, who is the chairman and professor at the Department of Media and Communication Studies, International Islamic University, Pakistan. Please welcome Dr. Zafar Iqbal in a warm manner.
Thank you very much. A very distinguished guest today, and I'm highly grateful to Gulf Cultural Club, Saeed Shahabi, and Shabir Rizvi introducing me and arranging this very important seminar, especially on a very important and what you call it as the most sensitive, one of the very sensitive issues that the whole world is these days confronted with, that we call Islamophobia. I would discuss Islamophobia into certain perspective today by looking at its definition. Of course, I will not take much of your time to discuss that what Islamophobia is all about, but the way, in fact, I look at it, because that is, in fact, leading me to go for some kind of deeper probe in understanding Islamophobia and then finding out some kind of prognostics to, in fact, address this kind of issue. So that would be then essential to understand that what Islamophobia is all about. So one very important component that would deal with my today's discussion would be, in fact, talking about what Islamophobia is all about. And second very important thing that I would like to address upon is that what are the reasons and what are the antecedents behind Islamophobia. Because before we go for any kind of, redressal to the issues of Islamophobia in different parts of the world, this is very important to understand that what important antecedents are, in fact, there to contribute to the overall this kind of, religious pandemic, or you can say a kind of, problem that the whole world is nowadays facing. And third very important aspect would be to see that how to counter Islamophobia. I will, in fact, draw certain lines or suggest very broader guidelines to understand that if we have to counter this important phenomena, which is very fastly spreading in the West especially, how we have to counter it. So I will be, in fact, talking about certain modalities, or you can say certain broad areas into my today's discussion. So first of all, I would like to go on to establishing a case or giving you a kind of preamble to what exactly I, in fact, focus at today. Islamophobia, as you all know, is a very complex bundle of episteme, discourses, and antecedents having multiple dimensionalities, ranging from mere dislike of Muslim and Islam to racism and threatening others, of which manifestations, nonetheless, we all know, are almost identical in different parts of the world. It is a buzzword in today's world, akin to terror and threat to peace. Modern literature on Islamophobia could hardly trace its existence from Iranian Revolution and called it a neology, as you might have come across this term, neology, from Runnymede report, while a deeper analysis demonstrates that Islam witnessed adversarial relations with other religions of the world since its birth in 6th century, or in early 6th century, you can say. The nature of adversaries, however, kept on changing due to geopolitical religious reasons. There was an adversary of being disliked to Islam in the beginning, which turned into fear due to unparalleled expansion of Islam, and then hostility due to Islam being a religion posing existential threat to other religions. And when Islam did not recede, expanding the hostility turned into some kind of denigration of Islam, its Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, and its followers to avoid people from other religions embracing Islam, which ultimately emerged in a kind of prejudice towards Islam and Muslims in variety of its forms. And Muslims turned into a race of people with eternal enmity towards others, and a disgusting race, of course. And contemporarily, it has taken many other shapes, like Islam as a symbol of terror. Contemporarily, it has taken many other shapes, like extreme fears and Orientalist other and opposing political, social, religious ideology, and the threat to the world peace overall. Thus, the phenomena of hatred, fear, prejudice, racism, otherings, Orientals, terror, and Western opposing ideologies, when combined together, they form Islamophobia. That's why I call it not Islamophobia, rather Islamophobias, a corpus of different kind of phobias. Not of all of them will be observed at one place at a time, but in either of the forms, Islamophobia may exist. Due to its furious nature and dissident Islamophobia has been variedly defined and explained in literature, and a consensus on its definition is yet to be reached. But its manifestations, of course, are mostly common and independent of their antecedents. Essentially, in a nutshell, I can say that Islamophobia is a negative posturing to Islam and Muslims, which is widespread as present and could hardly be unyoked from its history. I mean, this is very important to understand here that Islamophobia is not a contemporary phenomena. Rather, this is in fact yoked with history very what you can call it very strongly. Contemporarily, if I have to just reach to something about Islamophobia definition, I can say that contemporarily, neo-Islamophobia seems to have replaced the old notion of Islamophobia, which amounts to a social order for the Western world, where enmity and hatred towards Muslims, Islam as a religion, Quran, and Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, are the new normal. As one cannot, just giving you an example on it, as one cannot live in comfort and peace in the United States if he does not demonstrate dislike and hate towards communism and Russia. In Israel, if one does not hate Palestinians and does not consider Palestine as a Jewish land, in the West at large, if one does not acknowledge North Korea as a scar on the face of globe, the same has increasingly been developing towards Muslim and Islam in most part of the world. Such a remarkable state of affairs has degenerated, in fact, the respect for places of worship, people from other religious ideologies and colors in the West. That's why we see a lot of attacks on mosques and religious and cultural places in the entire world against Muslims. In the wake of 9/11 tragic epoch, concerns about Islamophobia has increased manifold, whereas terrorism and extremism are now alleged to be the key threats to international peace and security, apparently perceived to be the derivatives of radical Islam or Islamism. Consequently, several groups of people have been represented as a security threat. This applies to Muslim in general, whether a minority group or a majority group in a country, and the religion of Islam in particular. Anti-Muslim sentiments and Islamophobia has grown to the extent where Western identities and values are perceived to be threatened by Islam and Muslims. Therefore, Muslims have been securitized on different occasions across Europe, North America, Australia, or you can say the West in general. On this pretext, Muslims and symbols of Islam like mosques are subject to racial, criminal, and arson attacks in the entire Muslim world, in the entire world. Huge surge in Islamophobic racial attacks was observed in the United States immediately after 9/11, which was not less than 4 times of what used to be before the tragic catastrophe. What has been the case when Donald Trump took charge and made venomous statements against Muslims and Islam, saying Islam hates us, and banned entry of immigrants from 6-7 Muslim majority countries. During the first 4 months of his presidency, about 10 mosques were subject to arson attacks, where mosques were either totally burned to ashes or received severe damages. Racial attacks on Muslims surged to scores exceeding post 9/11 burn. According to FBI reports, more than 872 hate groups have been found operating in the United States only, mostly Islamophobic, sponsoring and spreading hate towards immigrants and causing rise in the far-right approaches. As a result of their efforts, anti-Islam and anti-Muslim campaigns fueled in all spheres of the United States, including media, film industry, social and political arenas, making Islamophobia appear as a lucrative hate industry, of which influences travel to other parts of the world too. The recent Islamophobic attack on Muslim families, mosques, and burning of Quran in Canada demonstrates the same trend as observed in the United States. Even political parties have become somehow Islamophobic and support ban on immigrants from the Muslim countries, like the Conservative Party in Canada, commonly known as Tories, which has 34% representation right now in Assembly, while the ruling party enjoying just 33% of the vote bank. So here we can very easily understand that what kind of imminent threat that the Muslims living in those countries are facing. Islamophobia in Europe has a long historical background. It has protracted roots in the European political system. In Britain, for instance, the right-wing political parties and groups are consistently proliferating Islamophobia in the name of Euroscepticism and British nationalism. Similarly, we can have certain examples from Germany. For instance, Germany is another very glaring example of rising Islamophobia and right-wing political approaches. Pegida, you might have heard this name. This is acronym of Pegida, which is an abbreviation, is the Patriotic Europeans Against Islamization of Occidents, operates in Germany, which initially started as a social media movement, but later that has turned to be a far-right anti-Muslim political and now the social movement, and has, you see, franchises all across Europe, including 7 Scandinavia. Its main focus is to resist the so-called threat of Islamization and Islamic extremism and calling for strict laws for restraining Muslim immigrants. It calls anti-Muslim protest in different European countries by enchanting repulsive slogans against Muslim immigrants by calling Muslims as burden on Europe and threat to the world peace. On the other hand, as you all know that France has crossed all limits to denigrate the Prophet of Muslims, peace be upon him, making France a living hell for Muslims. According to the media reports, about 70% of the prisoners in France are Muslims who have been convicted in petty crimes. Structural Islamophobia, where the government structures and institutions also become party to hate crimes against Muslims, seem to be rampant in France. Far-right insinuation towards Muslim in the political elite of the system in France is not a hidden phenomenon anymore, which makes it normal to be an Islamophobe there. Very briefly, I can say that Islam as a religion is the most hated religious ideology, and its followers, the worst creatures who are posing serious threats to the world peace. There is hardly any place in the West which is free from this religious pandemic. However, intensity and nature of Islamophobia are varyingly studied and found in different parts of the world. And any prognostics need to first identify the antecedents of Islamophobia, or you can say the problem, before any solution is placed as a remedy. Now, I will discuss something about the nature and antecedents of Islamophobia that, in fact, are contributing to generate or proliferate Islamophobia in the West. Islamophobia, as we all know, is a negative posture to Islam and Muslims. Mainly refers to prejudice, threat perceptions, and racism. And they could be, of course, independent of each other or otherwise. And prejudice may have different subdimensions. Similarly, threat perceptions might have different kind of subdimensions, like symbolic threat perceptions, like political perception, threat perception, like security threat perception, like socio-cultural threats. So these are different kind of perceptions that might exist over there. And similarly, racism. Of course, this is also very important to understand that racism is also very important antecedent to Islamophobia. So these are, you see, somehow you can say the epistemic dimensions of Islamophobia, which may not have the single antecedent, but you see numerous factors may contribute in cultivating Islamophobia at individual level or as a social order in a society. So they might exist, some of them coupled together or might be independent of each other, they might exist. History of prejudice and racism as antecedent Islamophobia are predominantly constant in various regions of the world, with varying degrees of force. Centuries-old enmity and demeaning cliches like Moors that emerged in the hundreds of years of combative interaction between Muslims and non-Muslims, and the nature of relationship between Muslims, Islam, and other, whether as friends, enemies, others, subjugators, usurpers, or as a radicalized group of people, are the main determinants of Islamophobia or Islamophobic sentiments. Contemporary Islamophobia thus carries a huge load of the past and is manifested in multiple ways. Fear and hatred are not Islamophobic as such, to my understanding, under my understanding, but are some of its manifestations. Others may include exclusion of Muslims, dislike of all or most of Muslims or Islam, feelings of disgust, etc. However, reasons for all these Islamophobic things, namely prejudice, different kind of threat perceptions, or racism, might differ in nature from each other before they become, you see, antecedent of Islamophobia. Concisely, I can say the nature of Islamophobia is very subtle and hard to observe at places and visible at some other. However, it depends on the nature of antecedents that are associated with it. As I have just said, Islamophobia may be constituted due to historic prejudice and racism, social, cultural, and political reasons, security and economic threats, or clash of civilization in a given society. However, manifestations of the menace are identical in most of the cases that may appear in shape of racial attacks, exclusion of Muslims from the mainstream, securitization, squeezed economic opportunities, lower status for children at schools and workplaces, and issues related to finding good neighborhoods, to just give you as some of the examples. Now, this is very important to understand that, the third phase, is how to counter Islamophobia. Because you see, this is something very important because we normally talk about Islamophobia in abundance, but without having any cognizance of it or much debate on it, that how it can be countered. Because this has now become an anathema, so it needs to be countered. But before we in fact move on to find it out that what exactly are the various ways through which we can counter Islamophobia, one thing that is essentially required to be understood, and that is that we have to understand that Islamophobia is an extremist ideology. And an ideology has essentially to be fought with a counter ideology. This counter ideology must be scholastic, academic, intellectual, socio-cultural, and political in nature. There is no way that this kind of menace has to be fought with the help of arms or with the help of scuffling state that might exist at some of the places. Rather, this is all scholastic, academic, intellectual, and socio-political. It needs to have multiple tiers involving people living in the West, the government of the Muslim world, academic and the research institutions. Additionally, a very comprehensive response and counter strategy should be based on some kind of, normative, social, and political theories capable of, in fact, reversing the problem and creating an environment of peaceful coexistence for Muslims living in the West. So, as a strategy, which is conceived to be somehow multi-tier, multi-pronged, and longitudinal, I would just say a few lines on each of the aspects of what you call it as the strategy for countering Islamophobia. Number one is intellectualizing and problematizing Islamophobia. Unless Islamophobia, as I have said earlier, is a very subtle and what you call it as a very complex phenomena, of which definition still I don't think that there is anything which can be agreed upon definition of Islamophobia. That's why I say that this is the much talked about but less understood concept. So it has to be unpacked for its meanings, for interpretations, for its conceptualization, for its operationalization, so that we should be able to, in fact, evaluate the extent of its occurrence in a given society. And once we develop this thing, I hope we would be able to problematize it, and we would be able to, of course, come up with some kind of solutions. Second, very important and broad area is the initiatives for the Muslims living in the West. I think there is something that we need to understand that I have personally observed in the United States, in UK, during my postdoctoral study living long in these societies. I understood, I could found it out that Muslims prefer to ghettoize in close places and at some unfounded fear, or otherwise leaving no or less space for integration in the mainstream. This creates virtually cultural and social gaps between the dominant population and the Muslim minority groups. This trend needs to be reversed to avoid some places in the major cities of the West labeled as dens of extremism, fundamentalism, and birthplaces of Sharia. I think this is very important for the Muslim living in the West to understand these things. Second important thing is that is in fact related to this aspect is that cultural and religious festivals and rituals like Eid, right now we are celebrating Eid, that could prove to be a great opportunity for Muslims to show to the West the beauty of Islam and a Muslim society. While in most of the cases, such events create some kind of, opposite feelings among the non-Muslims. So I think we have to understand this, that how can we in fact assimilate into the Western society by in fact putting those things which are in fact religious and somehow cultural rituals, so we can invite them to become part of those who are non-Muslims and the dominant societies. they are in fact dominant groups of people. They are supposed to be invited into of course these kind of rituals and these kind of festivals of the Muslim, so that they should be able to understand that Islam has colors and Muslims are capable of in fact enjoying things. Next very important thing that is in fact for the Muslim states, which is very important, as you all know, that Pakistan's Prime Minister, he has talked a lot about Islamophobia latest on very big international fora like UN General Assembly. He has been talking about Islamophobia. So I think this would be good for the Muslim states, that they should come up and launch certain research centers and chairs to study Islamophobia in its dynamics. Because as far as I understand, there are just a few or hardly where you see the surface level researches are being conducted, while the most of the important things that about Islamophobia are being done, that is in the West, in the United States. I can take certain examples from Oxford. I can take example from United States, like Berkeley University. They have a very good center researching on Islamophobia and racism. Similarly, Islamic Studies Center at the University of Oxford. So they are also conducting good researches. But Muslims countries should also have to, in fact, come forward and develop some research centers and chairs, so that they should be able to understand the phenomena and come up with certain solutions. Next very important thing is, which is in fact fourth one in terms of the broader category of responding to Islamophobia, that is the international organization and their task. I think that certain organizations have to play a very important role, or they can play an important role, but they are unfortunately not playing at all. This is what I have just observed in the kind of thing that they have done about Islamophobia, like OIC, Organization of Islamic Conference, and Muslim World League. They should take lead in monitoring Islamophobia and arranging finances for various projects aiming at reducing anti-Islamic trends in the West. Similarly, we can request them that they should come up and introduce certain laws where the blasphemy of Prophet ﷺ and Quran be made punishable on the analogy of Holocaust. So these are the things which are supposed to be done by them. And similarly, anything that is said about Prophet, peace be upon him, and Quran, that should be considered as a hate speech. And in the definition of hate speech, it should be incorporated. And of course, that should be done with the help of these organizations like OIC and MWL. Very important next thing that I have been constantly, in fact, promoting at various platforms is that Islamophobia has become now an industry. And of course, I can refer to a very good book, Islamophobia Industry Incorporation, published in United States by Nathan probably. So by taking that example, and of course taking certain excerpts from the CAIR, Council of American Islamic Relations in the United States. So they were saying that there are, huge number of funding is being made to certain organizations which are in fact creating hate against Muslim and Islam. So on the analogy of FATF, Financial Action Task Force, that has to in fact keep check and introduce certain very stringent financial protocols for some of the countries of the world, so that the money should not in fact spill to extremist ideologies or fundamentalist, or you can say terrorism. I think similar level, similar kind of thing should be introduced to stop funding for, Islamophobic things, or the hate mongers, those who are creating hates in the world, in the West or in the world.
So if you could please, I would appreciate it.
So Islamophobia FATF like things should also be initiated. Next very important thing is the fifth level approach, that is international linkages and association. I feel that there are international organizations working on Islamophobia, like even Gulf Cultural Club, they are arranging this seminar. Similarly, FAIR and FAIR in the UK and CARE in the United States, and other agencies as well. So they are in fact working in tandem without having some kind of cooperation and coordination with each other to reach to something which is in fact commonly destined, because they all are fighting against one thing. So they of course have to fight in a more concerted fashion, and they should in fact work together for the catastrophic kind of thing that is happening in the West, So they have to, in fact, reduce that by having their efforts joined together. And similarly, educational institutions or research institutions, they should also be, of course, coordinated with these institutions so that they should have they should have some kind of, research input that can help them further develop their strategies to counter Islamophobia. Next, very important thing that I would advise is that social media is nowadays becoming a very big and very important platform where you see the Islamophobic kind of things are there in abundance. And that has become now a global platform for transforming even normal mind into a Islamophobic one. As you know, the tweet jihad, or you can say Twitter jihadis, and these kind of new terms are now very common these days. So, and they are, of course, globalizing Islamophobia. The monitoring of social media is crucial to counter Islamophobia. First, to identify the discourses that create Islamophobia, and second, to identify the countries from where these contents are being produced. And this could be very easily done. Third is very important thing, that whether these contents are general reflection of historic Islamophobia or other way around. This would help in identifying the kinds of Islamophobia being created at social media and the dominant factors behind them. Similarly, we have to conduct, of course, research on social media contents so that we should be able to, of course, for that, we need to have social media labs, and social media disinfo kind of labs should be established, because social media is now very firstly and, of course, very big platform to spread Islamophobia.
Brother Zafar, if I could request you to conclude.
Okay, thank you very much. And next very important thing is mass media, games, and cartoon industry. Their intervention is also very, very important, because I feel that mass media overall, cartoon industry, games, these are also contributing to develop Islamophobia at different levels. And similarly, very important it is to have some kind of forum of interfaith and intercultural dialogues at international level, where we can interact together with each other to mitigate the kind of differences that might exist there. I think Islamophobia is a final word. Islamophobia is a global anathema, spreading like pandemic in the West, having multiple facets. It is holistic, academic, mediated, political, and organized schemes to malign and denigrate Islam, Quran, and Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Any sporadic and ill-conceived effort would do less good but more damage. It needs to be studied, deeply probed, and scientifically analyzed for research orientation and solutions and counter mechanism. This would be from my side, and I hope I would be able to answer certain things if anything comes out from the discussions later.
Thank you very much, Professor Zafar Iqbal. I'm sure there were some very, very pertinent points that were raised. I'm sure there would be questions raised, but you've done a very comprehensive task of sort of explaining how Islamophobia in each of the European countries is quite virulent at this time. Thank you very much.
Which means that half of Muslims live in the 10% most deprived areas. That Muslims find it harder to get jobs. Muslims find it harder to get a flat. Muslims find it harder to get insurance. Muslims find it harder to do all of the basic things that happen in life. Well, if you don't tackle this, how can you get further forward? And so I would say that we need to recognize these real manifestations of Islamophobia. We need to tackle them as a priority, but it shouldn't be the only thing we do. And I would never call this victimhood. I'd always call this highlighting the reality that people are facing, and make sure that we try our best to not fall into the trap of what racists want, which is we spend all our time trying to fight racism, that we don't spend that time developing ourselves as communities.
I would perhaps also request Professor Zafar, because you had a sort of a perspective internationally of Europe and so on, having studied there and also being an observer and writer on it. Do you feel that there's this issue of Muslims becoming, or at least justifying whatever is happening in the West as far as Islamophobia is concerned as victims, you know? What's your perspective on it, Professor Zafar? Can you put your the mic on, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting debate is going on calling Muslims as victim of Islamophobia. I think we have to see the whole picture in view. I mean, the global picture. Take example of Muslims living in some parts of France. Of course, are going through a different kind of state. I mean, if I take example of the people living, or the Muslims living in UK, they are in fact having far better opportunities not to become, in fact, declare themselves as victim. Yes, of course, occasionally there are certain things that, in fact, we can witness, like Punish a Muslims Day. I mean, these kind of things. I was there at that time when this day was being celebrated in 2018, and we were, in fact, you see, fearing for these kind of things, and we were said by our university that we don't have to move in streets on that particular day. So this is, in fact, some kind of events that we can come across in some parts of the world, but not essentially everywhere. The Muslims are, in fact, I don't think that they are, in fact, victim of. Certain countries, of course, are very important. In this case, I take France as the best example that could be quoted over there. Germany, that never used to be something like that, where the Muslims considered themselves to be victim of, you see, some kind of, in a way you can say, in a generic form, Muslims were, in fact, not over, something not like that. But rise of right wing in Germany, in fact, now has created a situation where the Muslims are always feel threatened. For instance, you can take example of Angela Merkel when she was first time coming into politics. So she was saying that Muslims belong to Germany, and she was, in fact, going to give this kind of things to the whole world. So Muslims are, in fact, enjoying a very good state over there. But once she saw that rise of the right wing is on the rise, I mean, the right wing is on the rise in the West, especially taking example from United States and taking example from France. So she, in fact, turned altogether her narrative. And during her lost elections, when she was campaigning, she was saying if Muslims have to live in Germany, they have to respect our values. So you see, in 10 years' time, she's changed her perspective about Muslims and things that were supposed to be there. So I think this kind of situation, in fact, bring about different kind of, you see, scenarios for Muslims, but taking it as a whole, that the whole West where the Muslims are living, they might be, you see, considered as victim of Islamophobia. I, in fact, do not buy this argument.
Criminal justice is an important area where that needs to happen, because Muslims who end up going into prison end up returning back to prison in the same way as other prisoners. That really causes problems for those communities and for all the people around those communities. And structural racism, like that which leads to Muslims being disproportionately impacted in prison, like all the other areas, needs fundamental root and branch reform, which has a long way to go.
Thank you. Professor Zafar, I know you wanted to sort of address the question before I sort of asked the Mirdad, because I'm conscious of the fact that he doesn't want to leave. So what's your sort of perspective from your international sort of research on this matter?
I mean, God has given a very important perspective that we have to bring about some kind of changes in the criminal justice system if we have to avoid structural Islamophobia in the West. I give you certain examples as well in this case. You might come across, you see, very recent case where a professor of Oxford University, once he landed in France, he in fact put himself, you see, for any kind of litigation or the charges that was leveled against him by two females some 15 years back. They were in fact molested. And what happened? The man is still behind the bar. And his case was, you see, not adjudicated for 2 long years. So what were in fact the reasons behind? I mean, this is something very unusual. The man who himself is coming to, in fact, put himself in front of you, to your criminal justice system, to try me on the kind of claims that have been made against or leveled against me. But you see, for 1.5 years, he was not even heard by in court, and he has to, in fact, put behind the bar just on the basis of charges. One another example I can give you in case of Nakola Besley Nakola. I hope you would recall this person, the one who in fact made or produced Innocence of Muslims in the United States. And you see, he had done something extremely blasphemous, 14-minute trailer that he uploaded on YouTube, and that created hue and cry in the entire Muslim world. There were more than 125 people died in processions in the Muslim world. And you see, there was entire world that was saying something bad about that, because this was not something as a piece of art which could be in fact produced. This was all in fact polemical. This was all in fact blasphemous. And what happened in the criminal justice system in the United States, in California, the man was in fact given, you can say, a freeway by the court. And once the pressure in fact mounted, he was put under house arrest for a few months so that he should be avoided, or he should be in fact saved from the wrath of, radical Muslims over there, because he has done something extremely bad. And he was put behind, house arrest for 6 months. And that was in fact not that he had done something very polemical, very blasphemous, and then uploaded it on internet. Rather, he was in fact put on the charges that he in fact violated the payroll rules that were set for him by the court of law in the United States. So this was the reason he was put at house arrest, not because of the thing that he has produced over there. So that in fact created some kind of anti-sentiment, anti-criminal justice system within the United States among the Muslims. So I think this is something very serious. If we have to take it, then of course the structural kind of thing that is happening in the West and in most of the Western countries, where the Muslims are subject to, of course, this kind of discriminatory treatment, this has to be, of course, very seriously addressed, and from very, strong international platforms, this has to be addressed.
Professor Zafar, I think Brother Saeed asked a question of the three Muslim leaders having their own penny's worth in the debate, if you like, and how the West is sort of marginalizing and if you like, the fanning the fire of Islamophobia. What impact do these leaders have? And quite often, these leaders are also in the West portrayed as hypocritical at many levels, that in their own countries, they have all kinds of discriminatory policies. Therefore, what they're saying shouldn't carry any weight. What's your view on that?
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting question, and plus I will also attach one remark that was made by one of our respected participants here in the chat room. So I will also, in fact, try to embed with this and making it something discussionable, really. Yes, of course, these three important president and prime ministers, they in fact talked about Islamophobia so often. Prime Minister of Pakistan and President of Turkey, and of course the Prime Minister of Malaysia. They most of the time talk about Islamophobia, and they come up with solutions, some sort of solutions as well. Lately, they come up with the solution that there should be, an international channel that should be established somewhere, either in Islamabad or in Istanbul or Kuala Lumpur, that in fact give a positive picture of Islam and Muslims to the Western world, and should in fact work to mitigate the effects of negativities that are there in the Western media about Islam and Muslim, so that its, peripheral effects in shape of Islamophobic feelings should be reduced. So they have been talking about that. And then what happened? This is something very interesting for all of us to understand. Then what happened? This was in fact something that had to face a huge backlash from the Arab world. Because the most important Muslim organizations like OIC and World Muslim League, all these big organizations, these are headed by the Arab Muslims, in fact. So this, in fact, created some kind of, rift between the Arabs and the non-Arabs. And that, in fact, made Pakistan's Prime Minister and even the President of Turkey to, in fact, come back and retreat back from the kind of promises that they made, that they would develop some kind of international networks of channels to counter Islamophobic kind of things. And then it was reason because that they in fact not incorporated, they had not in fact sought any kind of input from the Western, from the Arabian leaders. So that in fact created a huge problem. And this is now, you see, most of the time talked about it, that total world population, Muslims world population is 1.7 billion Muslims. And out of this 1.7 billion Muslims, 0.5 billion Muslims are from the Arab world. Rest 1.2 billion people are from the non-Arab world. Now, this is, you see, a kind of, you see, huge debate that's going on in the Muslim world, that why they have been given this right to, in fact, lead the Muslim world, the entire Muslim world, and to accept their, in fact, takes on developing some kind of, you see, what you call it, anti-Islam or anti-Muslim kind of things, and counter them. So this is a kind of, you see, debate that we can very easily find it in some of the Muslim world media. And this is under discussion this time. I mean, that's why you see they, in fact, retreated back, and they did not take any step ahead on this issue because of this kind of problem that, in fact, generated over there. Number one thing is this. And the second very important thing that has been talked about in the chat, that Pakistan, in fact, and Pakistan's Prime Minister is talking about Islamophobia in the West a lot on international fora. But they, in fact, are mummed when it comes to China and the Uyghur Muslims. Why they are not, in fact, discussed, and why their issues are not being, in fact, discussed at the international fora by the Prime Minister of Pakistan and any other renowned Muslim leader. I think this is something very important to understand, because China and Pakistan, I will be taking it from the Pakistan's perspective initially. China and Pakistan, of course, they are, you see, very neighboring countries, and plus UBOR, One Belt, One Road, and the CPEC, Pak-China Economic Corridor. So these kind of very important developmental projects are going on between Pakistan and China. So in fact, taking up anything which is, in fact, very internal to China, of course, would create some kind of problems between Pakistan and China, would affect, of course, the development process, or you can say the CPEC. Now, this is kind of bilateral effects of this kind of hue and cry on part of Pakistan to raise on the Uyghur Muslims, number one. Number two, very important thing is when we talk about Islamophobia and Muslims, and we talk, in fact, in a very general term and at the global level, without, in fact, mentioning, I mean, Prime Minister of Pakistan is not mentioning this thing on any forum, or any of the Muslim leaders, those who are, in fact, highlighting Islamophobia as an international issue, as international fora. They're, in fact, not discussing it that Islamophobia is on the rise in the United States, or in the UK, or in France, or in Germany. They do not talk things like that by naming any particular country in their speeches. So in that case, of course, on the same analogy, talking about China, which is, in fact, something that is, in fact, very internal, because Chinese Muslims are, in fact, not the immigrants, those who are living in China. They are, in fact, from within China, and the problem between the Muslims and the mainland China, I mean the Hans, the Uyghurs and the Hans, that is, in fact, not today's issue. Even 15th century, they, in fact, have been having this kind of scuffles between each other. So taking up this issue by Pakistan, that will definitely affect the bilateral relationships between Pakistan and, of course, China. Same we can say, I mean, taking example from why United States is not talking about Israel, that why they are illegally and illegitimately occupying the lands in Palestine. So I think you will hardly see that United States would be talking about things like that, but the entire world would, of course, be talking about it. So this is, in fact, their bilateral relations, and, in fact, criticizing United States on this would, of course, amount to a lot of criticism. The next very important thing that has just been said by Shahid Savani, that there are, you see, a lot of instances of, you see, discriminatory practices are there in Pakistan and in various parts of the world, where even the minority groups are crushed over there. There are reports about that they are not being given proper rights in these countries. So why don't they focus on this issue instead focusing on the international issue of Islamophobia in the West? I think, you see, this is a problem, of course, a problem that every country is. I hardly see any country which is problem-free and where the utopian kind of things are there. In Pakistan, of course, there are problems of, you see, these kind of discriminatory practices. But these discriminatory practices are not, in fact, up to that level there where they become, you see, international problem. For instance, here in Pakistan, there is hardly a few percent people. They are not even coming are making the double figure, those who are living in Pakistan and are in the minority groups, which are in fact very diverse in nature. I mean, the Sikhs are there, the Hindus are there, and the Christians are there. So they are in fact do not make such a huge number of people, those who are living in Pakistan, and laws are somehow discriminatory towards them. And the structural kind of Islamophobia, what you call is the discriminatory practices are there. These practices are, if are there, these are in fact very sporadic. And of course, not at the system level, rather at some cases you can see that discriminatory practices are on the rise. But I don't take it as a big problem which could be generalized at international level.
Thank you very much, Professor Zafar. Brother Mirdad has already left, but because the program is being recorded, I'll thank him also, and also obviously Professor Zafar Iqbal for having stayed the full course. Thank you very much for all the participants who were able to join us today, particularly those who perhaps took time off from their families to celebrate Eid al-Adha, and I'm ever so grateful to them as well, plus our guest speakers. And thank you very much for our team, technical team in the background who have put this program together. Thank you very much, all of you, and have a wonderful Eid, and look forward to seeing you all. I keep on saying this at the end of each program, that hopefully the next one at Abrar House will be in person, so that we'll be able to see each other in a different manner than able to see us in cyberspace. Thank you very much, all of you, the participants and the guest speakers. Good night. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zafar. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Julian, for being with us. Stephen,
Thank you very much.
Michael, Rodney.